afterwards. Uh, we are ready to go. Right.
Morning, everyone. Who is it? Rabbi just said yesterday. He knows when the school holidays are because they can see that I'm booked in to come. So it's lovely to see everyone here. So this week's parsha marks the transition. I suppose that we've um had all of the stories, and then last week we had Mishpatim speaking about the vast majority speaking about the sort of personal laws. This week begins the Mishkan, and therefore sort of the building of the discussion of the sanctuary, the clothing, and sort of then moving on to Vayikra to do with the sacrifices. So sort of, I suppose the nature of the learning of the parsha changes very, very slightly with that regard. So I just want to pick up on one line that has always fascinated me, which is as follows. So when we begin the parsha, we list all of the ingredients used for building the Mishkan. So you've got the gold, the silver, and various jewels, and then one of them is the or tachash. Okay, the or tachash, which is the leather of the tachash. Okay, we'll leave it untranslated because that's what I'm going to speak about right now. So the question is, what is this? What is this tachash animal that is listed? So there's it's really has. Sorry. Oh, okay, 1 second. No spoilers. We'll get there. We'll get there. So it's one of the things that's not translated. It doesn't really have any other mentions anywhere in Tanakh. It's actually got one other mention, in Yechezkel, where I think Yechezkel is told to make leather shoes to make shoes out of tachash leather. So sort of some kind of leathery footwear. So that's the only other reference to tachash in Tanakh. So obviously that's it begins a discussion over here. So Rashi quotes, all right, this is the Aramaic translation on the pasuk. So if you look in the Chumash, we've got the Targum Onkelos, which is a standard Aramaic translation, which dates to some very, very early times of the Mishnah. I think roughly, is that correct? Yeah. So first century, and that translates it as the word saskona or saskavna, which is a word again unknown to us. The Gemara is going to translate that. We'll see with the translation in a minute. But my general principle again, perhaps Rabbi Shissa can correct me on this, is that when we find translation, so the Aramaic translation obviously translates everything into Aramaic. But when it's an unknown, when it's a word that there's no sort of Aramaic equivalent for, it just leaves it almost as a sort of Hebrew-sized, it just changes it to sort of very, very slightly, but leaves it as a Hebrew word effectively. And you can see this in the jewels. Some of the jewels that are used in the various breastplates and so forth. Some of them it leaves it as the Hebrew equivalent, and some of them it changes to an Aramaic, to a completely different Aramaic word, which means that in the times at least of when the Targum was written, that as it's changing the word, it recognized what it was. So it was known at that time period. So the word saskana, the Gemara comments that it translates, it's made up of two different Aramaic words. The first one being sus, which is simcha, and there's susim for simcha, so happy, it's being joyous, but govna in its various colors. So the Gemara quotes that this animal was a multicolored animal, and it sort of took pride in it was a happy animal, it took pride in its various colors. So I'm going to read a passage in the Gemara which sort of deals with the identity of this animal, and then we'll discuss some modern sort of guesses as what it could be. So the Gemara says the Gemara is going off almost on a tangent as it often does, and wants to decide whether you can use the discussion is completely tangential. It's about whether impure leather, the sort of the leather from an impure animal, is can become impure or not. Right. So the laws of impurity for a Kohen or whatever are very, very complex. But if you're in a tent, then or sort of some kind of building, then the same building as a mace, impurity transmits. Does that count for a leather tent or not? So it certainly counts for regular leather, but does it count for the leather of an impure animal. And then the Gemara says, in that case, what about the leather of this tachash, right? Is the tachash, is that leather also counted or not? And the Gemara goes through a discussion about what this tachash could be. So first of all, there's a few things about it. First of all, the Gemara is undecided whether it's a kosher animal or an unkosher animal. Right? And it goes through it's unsure about it. And then the Gemara's conclusion is absolutely fascinating. So it says as follows that the Gemara asks the tachash that was in the days of Moshe, what happened to it? My Haviela. What was the conclusion with it? And the Gemara says is that the sages were undecided about whether it was a type of behema or a chaya, whether it was a domesticated animal or an under-domesticated animal, but it appeared for its time and then it disappeared. Okay, and it also says, one second, I missed out another detail, which says that it had a single horn as well. It had a single horn, it appeared for its time, it was happy with its many colors, but we're not decided whether it was an impure animal, a pure animal, impure animal, whether it was a type of domesticated or farm-like animal or a wild animal. And that's how the Gemara concludes. Absolutely fascinating discussion. So there are a few possible contenders that have been suggested over the years that could fit this animal. So you said before some kind of sea monster. Monster is a very strong word. There's one suggestion for an animal that's got a horn. So one thing that's not very. I wouldn't picture that. So sea. All right, let's stick with the sea for the time being. Giraffe will come to in a second. Spoilers. Anyone know? No. So unicorn. Okay, so we'll come to unicorn a bit later on. So there's one suggestion which I think is reasonably plausible. Narwhal. Narwhal. So it's got a horn. It does sometimes make its way up to the Middle East, I think, like the tributaries of the it does make its way over there. Sorry. The sea's over there. Come on. See, loads of things were, the Tachelis, was a sea snail. That was they got those in the desert. They went to the coast. They weren't a million miles away from the Arabian desert. They went to the tributaries of the Dead and Red Sea. And it sort of had some kind of doppled skin, leather-like. So that's one suggestion. Okay. Yeah, where's it live? Yeah. Oh, that was right. So I'm pretty sure it. Um, so that's one suggestion. Another suggestion. Sorry, another. Okay. Another suggestion is from Shlomi is a giraffe, which is an interesting one. What would you say about the horn business for a giraffe? It's got sort of on its head, sort of it's multicolored. If you're in the Arabian desert, you wouldn't necessarily see them very often. Sorry, lives in the Arctic. Okay, so again, in the days of Moshe, we can understand why you wouldn't necessarily see them that often. If you're in the if you're in the Arabian desert, it getting down there would be a bit of a miracle, right? So again, it fits in with the fact that it appeared for its time and then disappeared. A giraffe too. Giraffes obviously generally living in Africa. I don't know. We know that at the times of the Torah being given, animals lived in slightly different places. And it could be. By the way, there's we actually see in Tanakh throughout the Gemara and also Tanakh that lions were very common in Eretz Israel. The lions definitely lived in Eretz Israel in the times of up until the times of Gemara, but they were wiped out. But maybe not Gemara, but definitely at the times of King David. So giraffe also might fit the criteria. I think Natan Slifkin, who is known as the zoo rabbi, makes that suggestion. It also fits with the other criteria as well. Is a giraffe domesticated, undomesticated? It's one of the animals that might fit between those lines. Problem with a giraffe is whatever. There is a halakhic debate, obviously, about giraffes, about whether they're kosher or not. Um, I'll have to speak about. I think I met. So giraffes actually, it's pretty easy to find a place to shaft them because their neck is about 40 foot long. Um, yeah, yeah, can have yeah. I think the bigger problem with giraffes is persuading them to keep still enough for you to shaft them. I think they might argue, especially as they use their necks as their heads as a battering ram, and they use their necks are pretty strong. So I think the biggest problem with the two problems with the custards of giraffe, one is that persuading them to keep their necks still enough to shaft them it won't be necessarily great, and that's the other problem. That's the other thing. The reason why no, that's the other reason that people have never really investigated custards of giraffe is the same reason that you don't necessarily find non-Jews eating them, is that they probably don't taste so great. Yeah, it's not necessarily worth getting a giraffe down as as a as tasty as lamb. Um, so these are a couple of suggestions. Okay. Um, so just taking a step back. So the Gemara's got this sort of wonderful to and fro about this animal which is happy with its many colours. Um, but we don't really know very much about it, but it appeared for its time, and then sort of almost disappears. So um, Rav Cook has a piece about this. So Rav Cook wrote a short well, it's not short, it's very long. He wrote a commentary on the Agadic sections of the Gemara. I mean, it's a wonderful sefer. It's probably one of his more accessible ones, which is not necessarily saying very much. He only made it through a couple of Masechtas because, again, it says 4 volumes on the first two tractates of the Gemara. So he obviously didn't get particularly far with it, and he's got a few essays on this piece, and he says as follows. So the Gemara is revolving around the question about whether you can have do all holy matters, right? So the holy articles, Melecha Shemaim, does it have to be Huchshulapiv? So when you're making things like tefillin and mezuzahs, right, that they have to be kosher. It doesn't have to necessarily be shechted kosherly, but the animal has to be kosher. So the Gemara's question is that if so, does the tachash, which is surrounding the Mishkan, does that also have to be kosher? And he says that this is actually sort of a really important lesson. Because when it's dealing with matters of holiness, right, when it's things that we're actually dealing with ourselves, so in our world, so like we're using our mezuzahs, our tefillin, our sifrei Torah, they have to be kosher. They have to not have any mixture of things that are not kosher within them. That's only kind of inside our universe, as it were. Right? That when we're trying to be holy, we have to have sort of things that are clear and simple. Obviously, life is more complex. And that's why the tachash wasn't actually part of the Mishkan per se; it was the cover surrounding it. And when you've got the cover surrounding the holy matters, that's when you can have a mixture. And that's why the Gemara wasn't really sure: was this tachash? Was it kosher? Was it not kosher? The tachash itself was very happy, and as I use these words carefully, but it was a happy animal. It was a complicated animal. It had many colors to it. Things aren't black and white. They might be, narwhal colors or, purpley, various shades of brown. Okay. Outside the Mishkan, right, outside sort of, our holy space, life is going to be complicated. And that's why the covering of the tachash had this mixture of being, some different colors to it. And this is an idea for Rav Kook that is sort of very, one of his key ideas that Rav Kook said that viewed life as being complicated. He viewed people as being complicated, and that, in a way, led his whole project of, his whole view of Zionism, Torah, and the world generally, which is that people are complicated, and therefore he engaged with secular Zionism in a way unlike any other, sort of rabbi or certainly Jewish philosopher, because he viewed people as being complicated, and therefore would allow, sort of was able to view the holiness of people whose lives were, not necessarily led in that way. Yeah, but that's kind of outside our zone of holiness. Inside the zone of holiness, life has to be clear. And when sort of, suppose in a way that you're educating, you've got, a safe space that is short, right? Safe spaces to fill in, the things that are protecting us, the fact that we're dealing with on a daily basis, they have to be sort of quite simple. Outside world is much more complicated, and that's the idea of the tachash over here. So it's kind of one animal that we don't really know about, but that's the idea. We can't always know everything entirely. We can't always have everything absolutely clear. But that's kind of one of the challenges that God gives to us. Speaking a bit before, about how discussing just before the show, just how's the Michigan going to actually be built in real life? We don't know. We might have these questions. How do we integrate every aspect of this complicated world? We don't know. It's out there, but we trust that God is going to help us help these things coexist in a way that's healthy and holy. Right there from the top.
Thank you very much. Questions around? There should be a tachash in the biblical zoo in Jerusalem, maybe. Okay. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording now and turn off the Zoom, and we'll see those on Zoom next week. Thank you very much, Rabbi Gary Wayland.